What if RWBY Volume 1 was good? Like, really good. What if I was a writer for Roosterteeth, and Miles and Gary and Monty had me see if the script for RWBY Volume 1 worked the way they wanted it to? I would go through it with them, asking a lot of questions, take what works, what doesn't work, and rework it with them, as I'm going to do with you right now. The biggest problem with Volume 1 is that it doesn't have much of a plot and no structure to let the characters breathe. It has great ideas and interesting characters, but no narrative through line, which is somewhat understandable because it's essentially the first act in a 3-part season, but contemporary writing conventions for long-form stories allow introductions to have their own beginning, middle, and end. Let's start with the opening narration by Salem. Now, opening narrations can be vital for fantasy stories that are so far removed from Earth, but they are also a little top-heavy. This is why most writers would develop a fish-out-of-water character to explain how the world works, like the Pevensies in Narnia, Dorothy and Oz, or Alice in Wonderland. The opening narration we have is serviceable but unnecessary. The first scene is actually a standout scene. We know dust is valuable because Torchwick is trying to steal it. We see its uses in the fight. From there, it's pretty standard superhero fare, like the unaired Batman teaser that was edited into being the series opening. The biggest change in the scene should be RWBY actually stopping Torchwick and having him beaten, but his reinforcements arrive first, maybe have Torchwick give a smug comment, his reinforcements start to blow RWBY away, and then Glinda finally shows up, thus giving adequate comparison of RWBY's ineffectiveness against Cinder, and Glinda forcing them to retreat. Through theming, the scene lets us know what RWBY may be able to do and how far she can progress throughout the series. The Ozpin scene is also pretty good, weird animation aside. This is where we get RWBY's motivations. Motive is an important starting point for a character. When done well, over time we'll sympathize with that goal. The more specific the better, so be specific. Don't just say RWBY wants to be a huntress, tell us what a huntress does. The kingdoms are in place to defend the people, the huntsmen are the ones doing the defending. And this exposition flows organically because the whole thing is staged like an interview. The scene after that, though cute, is a bad way to end the first episode. The first episode should end with Ozpin telling RWBY she's going to Beacon, then cut to that kick-ass opening. Then start the next episode with Yang and RWBY's bit. Here we see that even though RWBY is excited, she's not sure she's ready, which is a running theme in the songs but never comes up after her first day of class. This episode is even more important because it is our true introduction to the other 3 leads. So, a few changes to these first encounters. RWBY is the one who gets all wonderstruck and runs off, which will be a running thing in the show. Get it? Yang just lets her go and promises to meet up with her later. Then her recklessness gets her in trouble with Wise. Blake steps in to confront Wise, but then Wise doesn't back down. Blake pulls a whatever and walks off. Wise walks off in another direction, leaving dazed RWBY to question herself once again. Then there's Jean, the only student less prepared than her. Now, we don't know Jean is useless yet. We know he's bumbling but good-mannered. They walk around and talk, we get exposition on Jean's weapon, a connection is made, shipping ensues, and everyone meets up in the auditorium. Then we're going to pull a bait and switch Ozpin's speech here with his speech in Volume 2, which gives exposition on the Vital Festival and how it all connects with the Great War and how it's championed by Ozpin and the ideals of being a huntsman. And the entire initiation arc makes no sense. So, when a huntsman graduates, they get free reign to do whatever the hell they want. Most teams split up, so why would codependency be a big part of their training? Well, a big theme in ensemble pieces is how extreme personalities don't get along, and we already know that Weiss is going to be openly hostile to people and Blake is going to be secretly hostile. These arcs basically write themselves, is what I'm saying. So the initiation, instead of being 2.5 moderately long episodes, make it just 2. We see our 4 leads and 4 supports. The other 3 would be introduced as they are, making a mad dash for the relics and needing to work together to take on the bigger Grimm. So, Jean not knowing what aura is really, really dumb. I get why they did it, but it was really dumb. So, Pyrrha and Jean talk about it in specific terms. None of this vague bullcrap the writers tried doing. It protects you from damage, has limits, manifestation of a soul, Jean's is strong. Use the word strong because a lot in the context of a soul is just stupid. And they talk about it casually, demonstrated with Rain. This stuff should be common knowledge even for someone with no combat experience. You could even have this scene but change the context to Jean not knowing how to use his aura. It is also imperative that somewhere in the segment we get a mention of semblance. I can totally see Yang asking the question in a vain attempt at small talk, only for it to make matters worse because Blake. And for the last fight, reinforce Yang's protective nature, have Jean come up with the ideas, Pyrrha only contributes her skill, Weiss is forced to accept that if she wants to get out of here alive, she has to work with RWBY, and gives slight visual indicators about Blake's cowardice. RWBY's impulsive, but ultimately rallies the team together, cut out Run and Live, and have the two big grim cut off their only escape route. Team Juniper, by circumstance, holds off the Deathstalker, while the soon-to-be Team RWBY uses their greater mobility to take down the Nevermore, and this, not the relics, dictates the teams and the leaders. And now that we've established all the players and pieces, and reminded the audience that this is an action show, let's use the school setting. There's this thing that separates good films from great films, and that the more you watch a great film, the more you'll appreciate it. So instead of having Bort go blah blah blah, have him actually give some background exposition about the Grimm. It could be like a prototype of that world of Remnant that isn't going to happen. The focus in this episode is RWBY is the leader and has to come to grips with what that means, while Weiss has to come to grips with the fact that she's a stuck-up bitch that nobody likes and needs to get off her high horse. We could also maybe hint at some resentment of the Faunus, which will come into play later. Badge of the Burden is a great episode, and all it needs is a second pass at a draft to make sure everyone stays in character, namely Blake, who will be avoiding confrontation whereas Yang throws herself out there. What came next was awful, and these three should be ashamed of themselves. So this is where the greatest change is going to come in. We've highlighted Blake's timidness and Yang's impulsiveness. We've established that Jean has a good head and a big legacy and doesn't have a clue. But they are also holding secrets. So my biggest order of business would be to thematically tie in the two big reveals from Volume 1. It would first be set up at the end of Episode 5, in the scene where Weiss makes RWBY coffee, and a beat where she talks to Blake. Weiss apologizes to Blake for her superiority complex and admits that she doesn't have high regards for her father. This is where we get the first hint at Weiss' motivation and where it stems from. But Blake doesn't push it any further because we want to keep Blake in character. So episode 6 starts with Jean getting his ass kicked. Here we see the tournament rules and our first real mention of the Vital Festival and an explanation on how Aura works. Cardin instigates both arcs in this case. His constant harassment of Jean highlights his ineptitude, and his treatment of Faunus triggers Blake. Now, here's the catch. Blake accidentally reveals her identity to Yang. Maybe have Yang walk in on her while she's putting on the bow or something. Jean, on the other hand, comes clean to his team when they push him for answers. You could even spread this out for 2 episodes. Episode 6 ends with the cat's out of the bag. Episode 7 focuses more on how the two teams are dealing with their situation, whereas Yang and Blake are worried about Weiss and some of the other students. Jean becomes encouraged by his team, but ends up leeching off them a bit. Cardin picks up on this and exploits it. Maybe he even eavesdrops on one of Jean's conversation and realizes this. Episode 7 ends with RWBY telling Jean to man up, maybe even confiding her own fears about not being ready. She tells him that he should confide in his friends and team, but he's going to have to better himself eventually. This turns Jean's arc from one of stupidity and stubbornness into one of owning up and becoming proactive. Because we're integrating dual plot lines, it's okay to spend multiple weeks on this arc. The problem conceptually, aside from cliche bully tropes, is that for 4 weeks straight we barely saw the Team RWBY. Now we have an A-plot and a B-plot. A-plot is RWBY, B-plot is Juniper. Episode 8 goes similarly to the real Forever Fall. Cardin blackmails Jean. Jean fears that he'll get kicked out and lose his chance to better himself, but when he sees his team, he chooses them over his own selfishness and fights back. This attracts the Ursa, and Jean fights along Team Cardinal because they're all there to fight monsters, so having 3 guys run is just pathetic. The noise of battle is what attracts reinforcements, and it's RWBY, not Weiss, that nearly jumps in, partially because of her impulsiveness, and partly because she's the one who told Jean to man up in the first place. The episode ends with Goodwitch stepping in and revealing that she already knows about Jean's lack of qualifications. And even though she would like for Jean to not be there, it was Ozpin's call and he's done well enough so far. Jean presses further and Glinda points out that his team has had the best synergy out of all the freshmen. Now Juniper is together, and even though RWBY is somewhat together, they aren't completely. Blake is still scared of how Weiss will react if she knew her secret. She also hasn't told Yang everything. Yang knows she's a Faunus, but she doesn't know about... yeah. So episode 9 will start with the girls in Vale. From their dialogue, we establish that the semester is over and students from other schools will be arriving soon. This is a great chance for world building and cementing interactions. Blake was born outside the kingdom, so she wouldn't know much about the Vital Festival, and Weiss is all too eager to gush over it. RWBY gushes over the tournament because she's a weapons nut, and Yang gushes because she likes dancing and partying. Blake is the fish out of water here, which puts her at an odd place. The rest of the episode pans out much the same. They run into a looted dust shop, Weiss makes bad remarks of the White Fang, RWBY points out that Torchwick is still out there, Sun makes things worse by showing up chased by the police, and the episode ends with RWBY giving chase. Episode 10 would be the chase. Team RWBY chasing down Sun but running into Penny. Sun gets away after a subtle hint that he knows Blake's a faunus. Penny's introduction also stays the same. The difference being that RWBY isn't the only one that befriends her. Weiss should too. Penny recognizes Weiss and explains that she's from Atlas. But Weiss doesn't react that well because she does not like her father. But RWBY takes a bit of a liking to Penny. It's like in real life where the previous new kid befriends the new kid and is like, finally, I'm not the one who's clueless. Weiss laments that they weren't able to catch the rapscallion and Blake gets offended. The argument keeps going and escalating. See, now this builds tension because we know that Blake is a faunus. We don't want Weiss to look down on her like she did Sun. Neither does Yang. Yang becomes the audience surrogate for this argument and RWBY is left in the middle trying to be a good leader for all her teammates. We divert audience expectations with Weiss being the one that snaps first. She shares her history with the White Fang and how it affected her. Now, I love that she calls it her grandfather's company, even though it's her father the White Fang hate because, well, she can't blame them on that note. So Weiss is the first to shout and Blake drops a bomb. Realizing that the cat's out of the bag, she runs and runs into Sun. Next episode is focused on Blake and Sun. Sun explains where he comes from and that he is a Haven student, went home to Vacuo for a break, then stowed away on the ship with the Shade students. Blake explains what she's doing. See, these two characters don't know each other, but they're both faunus, so there's instant relation there. I'm not even talking about shipping. This is an important moment for lore dumping. But we're going to change it from what Monty and the others wrote. You see, Sun is a faunus, and it's implied that he is more or less on the wrong side of the law. Though through his brief backstory, we know that's not exactly true. Basically, we're showing the racial tensions through Weiss and the police, instantly thinking the worst of him, and we're doing it without spelling it out. The problem with the scene in black and white is that there's no reason for Blake to be telling Sun this. They both have lived in Remnant their entire life, so Blake telling Sun about the history of the faunus is like one millennial American telling another millennial American about how 9/11 happened and how that led to war. It's dumb. The lore works, but the way it's presented is dumb. None of the characters are learning something. The exposition dump is for the audience and the audience only. So, how do we make this more organic? Well, tell it exactly from Blake's perspective. No vagueness, no lies, just a clear and concise story about Blake's past. Maybe even tie in the bow with it, like maybe her parents would have her put on the bow during rallies to synthetically spark humans to support them. Also, Blake's parents being the former leaders of the White Fang, ripped that cat right out of the bag. There's no reason to be vague about this, especially when a theme of this volume is opening up. And she feels safer opening up to Sun than her team because he's a faunus. I'm going to do something with this later. But that's not all we do for this episode. We also have the hunt for Blake starring Team RWBY. And you know what? Because Juniper exists, maybe have them in on the search too, even if it's just off screen. Another dumb thing about the script in these episodes is how fast Weiss goes from innocent never run to I don't care. I like these two beats, but there's a few beats missing in between. So in the RWBY scenes, Penny is just being adorable, RWBY is having a crisis because a split team looks bad on her, Weiss is still fuming over Blake's lie, and Yang is the one who talks sense. Yang is terrible in these episodes as they were presented, so let's give her a little bit of insight. What does she think of the faunus? What does she think of the SDC? I just set the groundwork for an entire episode right there. And maybe coming from a perspective that does have feelings, but no axe to grind either way, she can get Weiss to really think about how she treated Blake and, to a lesser extent, Sun. Which Weiss takes to heart, remembering her previous conflict with RWBY. Then the episode ends with Blake recapping how this whole mess began, the dust store robbery. Sun puts on his detective cap, and uses his street knowledge to find out where they're likely to strike. Seriously, the logic Sun presented in the scene is pretty good, so we'll keep it. That brings us to the last episode of the volume, the culmination of all these themes of friendship and trust and race and duty. Blake and Sun find the White Fang and Roman Torchwick. They crash the party and fights ensue. So the worst part of the Volume 1 finale was how pointless the fight was. Like, Penny basically takes care of it in just a few seconds, and Weiss and Yang aren't even there, and it was just clearly a weapon demonstration for two characters who ended up not amounting to much. So scrap that noise. Sun and Blake do well against the goons, but Torchwick is a little harder to handle. Not only that, but they're severely outnumbered. Blake's reaction nearly gets them killed, but who is the first to jump in and take a bullet? RWBY, of course. The cavalry arrives. Weiss takes some frustration out on some goons. We get some demonstrations for Penny and Sun. RWBY's the one to pick Blake up after she fell, while Yang holds off Torchwick. Maybe even use this as a good time to state Yang's semblance. Blake tries apologizing. Weiss is like, time and place, and Team RWBY defeats Torchwick and he's arrested. Shh, I'm going to do something with this. Teamwork and camaraderie win out over evil. Blake and Weiss make up. Blake explains that she is no longer associated with the White Fang. The White Fang she once respected died when her parents stepped down. Weiss says something similar in regards to the SDC. The White Fang that Weiss hates exists and deserves her hate. The SDC that Blake hates also exists and deserves her hate. The SDC that Weiss loves is no more, taken from her grandfather by Jacques. Just like how the White Fang was taken from Gira and Callie by Sienna Khan. Just because one has cat ears and one looks like a porcelain doll, they're not so different. Parallels! And thus we fade to credits as RWBY admires her hand in catching the bad guys and keeping her team. So before I talk about what I'd have as the post-credit scene, let me ask you a question. How come Roman Torchwick never got caught? When asked this, the writer said spoilers, but it never came up again. You mean to tell me that not a single huntsman was hired to bring in Torchwick? Well, let's do something about this. You can have it one of two ways. Either Torchwick has a warping semblance and escapes and runs to his warehouse, or the police drag him to the warehouse and let him go. There he meets Cinderfall, who expresses her disappointment at the night. They have arrived in Vale, and they are not done with Roman. So, yeah, that's how I would have RWBY Volume 1 pan out. What did you think? If you liked it and you want to see more videos, hit that like button and leave a comment and subscribe.